Welcome to Seed 360, a Pioneer Seeds Australia podcast for everything in, on and around the seed. So Bill, when we think about the US dairies being involved in Pioneer quite a while, we think straight away about maize silage or corn silage. And why is corn silage such a good base for a dairy ration?
Oh man, there's a lot of reasons. And I'll go back to growing up on a farm in upstate New York where we had really kind of marginal soils and very hilly. I think what it does is it makes a small farm feed big just because of the tonnage we can grow. If you think about the consistency of corn silage compared to grasses or cereals that as they mature are going to change dramatically in terms of fiber digestibility. The fiber digestibility of corn silage is very often less variable and higher than even lucerne or alfalfa, which has always been kind of a core of our diets here in the States, is really been alfalfa and corn silage. But alfalfa has been declining in terms of acres in North America for the past 25 years. In fact, Corteva, we just sold off our alfalfa business 2 years ago. You can kind of see the writing on the wall that, you know, in terms of the United States and Canada, there just isn't really that many alfalfa acres anymore. As you get out west and they have really ideal environments for growing alfalfa, like in Idaho and Washington State and places like that, it's still going to be an important crop for them. But when you get to the Midwest and the East, alfalfa is just a difficult crop. And corn silage is just so much easier. It's a place we can put a lot more manure. We can't really manure on legumes. Corn silage takes a lot less labor. We plant it once, we harvest it once. We're not doing multiple harvest. What else? Oh, starch, obviously. We're not only getting that great fiber digestibility, but we're getting starch. And ensiling ease. You know, alfalfa is tough to ensile because of the buffering capacity of the proteins, and grasses can be the same way. But with corn silage, you have low buffering capacity, you got lots of sugars to drive fermentation. So there's just so many reasons, you know, why it has advantages. And also the other thing is in terms of genetic improvement. You know, with alfalfa, we see very little genetic improvement, partly because probably not a lot of money in that crop for people to invest money into research. But, you know, corn's a different story. You know, since 2000, we've seen increases of about 1 3/4 bushels per year, per acre per year. I know that won't mean anything to you, so I did the math. It's about 47 kilos an acre a year. I didn't convert it back to hectares. You guys will have to do that.
It's about 100. It's about 100.
Yeah, so we've seen that increase in that. Now that's grain yield. Biomass yield hasn't increased all that much. Pretty stable. But if you think about the energy concentration, the grain and corn silage contributes half of the yield and 65% of the energy in corn silage. So the more grain we can pack into that metric ton of corn silage, you know, the better it's going to be. If you look at, I was just looking at, you know, who's got the highest milk production in the world. And the list is Israel is number one. In fact, I was just with some Israelis last week, and one of them grew up on a dairy kibbutz, and it was very interesting to talk to him about his experience. But Israel, their average production per cow is about 12,000 kilos. We come in second in the United States with about 11,000 kilos, and then it's followed by Denmark, Netherlands, and Canada. But if you think about, you know, 11,000 kilo herd average today, that's our average, but it's, you know, it's very, very common to find Holstein herds. I mean, thousands of cows in a herd milking over 45 kilos a day with a 4.5% test and a 3.2% protein. I mean, unbelievable production. And how do we get to that next hurdle? That's what I think about every day is how do we get these herds to that next level of production? You know, it's 45 kilos. That's not where these guys want to stop. That's not the ability of the Holstein breed either. We can produce a lot more milk. We've got kind of a lot of the housing figured out. We really need to bring the nutrition to bear. And again, how do we get to the next level? That's why I think we continue to see more and more corn silage in the diet. But just a little bit on the history, you know, when I first came out to Wisconsin to go to grad school, here's what I was told by my professors. I don't know what they taught you at Cornell, but we don't feed all that corn silage out here. We feed cows half of their forage is lucerne, half of it's corn silage, then a high moisture ground ear corn and soybean meal. We're not feeding 70 to 80% of the forage as corn silage like you New Yorkers. Well, today they are feeding it exactly like us New Yorkers did. We can get up to 70% of the diet being forages, and which is great for rumen health. And of that 70%, 70 to 80% of that is corn silage on these big dairies. And that's just a big, big change because these cows need so much energy.
Yeah.
Long answer to why corn silage is important, but
well, I guess,
it's just an amazing crop.
And we could probably go for another hour, I guess. I'm sure there's a lot more in it. So I guess you did answer a little bit. I did have a bit of a follow-up question about the percentage, like how hard you push corn silage in the ration. I guess you did answer that there, like 70, 80%. So I guess here in Australia, we do feed a bit of grain, what we call feed it in the bale, like we feed it at milking time. I guess, is there much of that done in the US, and do they use corn grain in the ration much, or is it all through the silage?
No, is there another grain other than corn? I'm not familiar with it.
Well, we do have a little bit of wheat here and a bit of barley.
Yes,
too,
I know I'm going to get in fact, what's interesting is your largest dairy in Australia is being fed by one of my former students and a nutritionist who I taught both of his parents. So I do have a little bit of a link into how you guys are feeding cows over there. We also are feeding extra grain to our animals, and it's corn-based. We feed very little barley or wheat, like what you guys do, or palm kernels or anything like that. What we've learned about corn silage is when you ensile it, the fiber digestibility never changes. Whatever it was the day you harvested it, that's what it will be forever. But starch digestibility does change over time. It ratchets up over time for about 6 months, and then it plateaus. So what we've learned in these really high corn silage-based diets is the best complement for them is what we can grow the most of, which is corn, but not high moisture corn or not fermented corn, because we already have a lot of fermented kernels, obviously, coming from the corn silage. So what we're complementing it with, it tends to be dry, finely ground corn grain, which is quite a change for our industry, because in the past, feeding high moisture corn that we would ensile, or we will take a harvester and put a corn head on the front of it and actually just snap the ears off. We call that snaplage. So we're grinding up the cob and the kernels and some of the husk, everything all together. Just a fantastic feed, very cheap to put up. Just, a great feed, but it does not couple really well in terms of with high corn silage forage diets, because we've just got too much ruminally fermentable starch. So that's one of the kind of the changes that's happened in the last probably 8 to 10 years here in the United States.
So I guess you touched there on fiber digestibility, and there's a lot of interest here in Australia around BMR corn and how that might help drive that fiber digestibility. And I guess we'd be really interested in getting your thoughts on BMR and how that might help go to that next level that you were talking about.
Yeah, BMR has been very, very successful in the United States among nutritionists and some dairy farmers. In terms of the opportunity for you guys in Australia, I think it's just fantastic. The main thing that BMR does is it's a naturally occurring mutant, and it has less lignin in the plant. Now, that can be a little bit of a problem in terms of drought tolerance, because lignin is very important in water transport in the plant. So they're tend to have some, little bit more difficulty. So we've always recommended that it be planted on, better soils, and if there was irrigation possible, that they be irrigated. But again, where we see in the Midwest and the East, where it's been quite popular, farmers just loved it, mainly because it drives intakes. Because you have less lignin, the cell wall is more fragile, and so it tends to move through the animal faster. And so what it's doing is increasing intake of the whole TMR or PMR, whichever it might be in robotic dairies. But it's really going to drive intake, and that's what we love. So when we recommend the use of it, it really has, if you're going to plant BMR and use it in the best spot you could use it would be close-up cows, say 2 weeks before they calve. The next best place to use it is in the fresh group or the high string group after they calve. So that's where the better dairies who really capitalized on the use of BMR, they're planting maybe 20% of their acres to BMR, and that's being allocated to those cows that you're really trying to drive intakes to. The close-up group and the fresh group, where there's still mammary cell proliferation, and we're trying to get that peak as high as we can. But then we're switching those cows to the standard hybrid. Now, that's easily done for larger dairies, not so easily done for small dairies. Some small dairies will actually feed BMR to everything because they're not going to have a separate pile for BMR and a separate pile for standard. But the little bit larger dairies, not the mega dairies, but the little bit larger dairies, say 500-600 cows, that just, works pretty well to be able to divide up and allocate BMR where it has its best use.
Great insights there, Bill. And I guess we're on the beginning of our journey with BMR. Like, it is quite exciting. We've commercialised our first hybrid, which will be available next year. And there is a lot of interest. So I guess the other thing, the real driver of performance in hybrids here has been planting population. Have you seen a similar sort of trend in the US to what we're seeing here?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the trend for increased bushels per acre, it's a parallel line to increased plants per acre. If you take an individual plant from the 1950s and an individual plant from today, put it in a greenhouse, you're probably not going to see a whole heck of a lot of difference in yield from that one individual plant. Now, yes, there have been some improvements in efficiency. We have more vertical upright leaves to capture more solar radiation. But really, a lot of what we've bred for is just genetics that can handle the stress of high populations. And we test hybrids, up to 70, 80,000 plants per acre. And, I know your population is probably somewhere around 80,000 plants per hectare, somewhere in that range for silage.
Probably pushing to 100 now. Yeah.
You're up to 100. Okay.
In some hybrids, yeah, for sure.
Irrigated with the right hybrid in the right environment, but can also be down as low as some dryland sites in Queensland that are planting, 40,000 per hectare. So we've got a real range depending on where you go.
We're probably in that 80 to 90,000 for silage in a lot of our dryland areas is pretty common spot. One thing I want to point out, and I'll definitely share this in my seminars, but I don't know if you've heard it in Australia. Maybe I shouldn't even mention it to not start a myth. But here's one of the myths that's going around is if we plant lower populations, we're going to improve fiber digestibility. And the research is really, really clear that that's not the case. The thinking is if we plant lower populations, we narrow up our stalk. And then your rind to pith ratio is pretty high. If you plant lower populations, you have a bigger stalk. So your rind, which is not as digestible to your pith, is lower. There have been several university studies and one pioneer study that has shown that you give up so much yield by planting at low populations, and you simply do not have any statistical or biological improvement in fiber digestibility. So, I want to put the kibosh on that. What happens, I know as I travel around the world, is people read U.S. magazines and dairy publications, and not every publication vets out the information. Some of these publications will print whatever a marketing department from any company will send them. And sometimes you hear, people abroad will read things and think, oh man, this is what the Americans are doing. That's why they got this high production. One of the things that you don't want to do that's getting some recognition is this lowering plant populations. It just makes no sense from a fiber digestibility standpoint.
And like you say, we're all striving for higher yields, and population's helping us really drive that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on Seed 360. Like and follow us for more episodes like this one.